Holiday students, this is Mrs. Delgado, and I will be serving as your U.S. history teacher until further notice. I will get to meet you next week, Tuesday, at whatever time frame you are slated for, whatever period you have me for. And so we'll get to meet then. Until then, the next few weeks, we will be reviewing the American Revolution. But for today, we are going to solely focus on the French and Indian War. And so you're going to watch this recording. It will be divided into two parts. So this is the first recording. Also, take the time to listen to the second recording. We're going to briefly go over it next week, but it's pretty much going to catch you up for what we are going to be doing together as a class next week during our meeting. I'm going to go on to the next slide. We have three objectives for today. The first objective is we will know how the French and Indian War began. Second, we will understand how it started the road to revolution, the Revolutionary War. And lastly, we will be able to explain the key historical figures and events that took place. So let's go ahead and begin. What you're taking a look at here is not a map into too much detail. It just outlines the shapes of the different continents around the world with the exception of Antarctica. But what it does is it breaks down the New World versus the Old World. Now, I provided this slide for you because I'm going to be throwing out the terms colonists, colonies, New World, Old World, and it is so important that you understand what those terms do actually mean, or it might be meaningless, or you simply might be confused. Now, on this map, the green represents the New World, so you can see it right here where I'm hovering over, as well as this part known as Australia today. And the Old World, which I'm hovering over, is the eastern part of the world today. Now, the Old World consists of countries and areas that are already established. They have cities, towns, they have governments and monarchies and empires and dynasties. So they are already established cities and settlements. They're conquered territory. The areas with the green are uncharted territory. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have anyone living there, because as we know in the United States, if you can remember, there are Native Americans there. But these old world folk, they don't consider them to be conquered. So they're going to conquer these areas themselves, and they're going to send over representatives. So for instance, England will see this, the United States and other areas in the New World, the uncharted territory, as a possibility to take on more land, to own more land. So they're going to be sending colonists from the eastern part of the world over to the western part of the world, the New World, and they're going to tell these colonists, these people, that they're moving to this new location, and they are to settle, and they are to help England basically infiltrate and own different parts of the world. Spain is going to do that as well, and you'll see that with France, and you'll see a lot of those locations in the maps that are going to be in the next few slides. So again, if I throw out the word old world, that means it's the place that was already established, and they have governments and cities and monarchies, dynasties, whatnot. And if I throw out the term New World, it's just talking about those land areas that have not really been explored and conquered. Or if they were, then they're basically up for grabs and they're battling it out. If I throw out the word colonists, you already know that these are people that were sent from their country over to the New World to help to explore and conquer more territory and live there and establish towns there. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. A bit of background information. I have this map, and this map is a lot more detailed than the map in the previous slide. We have this shape here, and you may recognize this as the United States. But back then, during the time frame that we're going to be referring to during the French and Indian War, these were simply British colonies, French colonies, Spanish colonies, and I divided into four different colors: yellow representing the British colonies or British claims, pink, French claims, green, Spanish claims, and this bluish purple here will represent the Russian claims, which is over here. Now, it's important that you understand that France and England had been going at it for years, and we're talking centuries. So it doesn't just start with the French and Indian War. They were enemies for such a long time. And the reason why is it's really a chest pumping, a muscle flexing competition. Everybody at this time wanted to dominate and take over the world. And how do you do that? You acquire more land. And that's exactly what they saw as an opportunity when the new world opened up. So everybody's going to want to conquer, everyone's going to want to take over the world. And the two stronger countries at the time were France and England. And so you're going to see them duke it out during the French and Indian War. The war was fought in Europe from 1754 to 1763, and it was also fought in this US area. Now, again, it's not called the US during this time. I'm simply referring to it as the US because it's a term that you're more familiar with, but it was fought in that area from 1754 to 1763 as well. It is known all around the world as the 7 Years' War. Now, the funny thing is it's called the 7 Years' War, but if you take a look at the time frame, it's from 1754 to 1763, which is 2 years longer than 7 years. It's a total of 9 years. And you'll see why it's from 1754 to 1763, as well as you will know why it's called the 7 Years' War all over the world. Now, some of the causes of the war, these blue symbols here represent the blue French forts, and these red symbols represent the British forts. Now, this area that I gave you a map of is called the Ohio River Valley. Now, the British were concerned, the English, were also concerned about the French forts, and they thought the French forts were intruding into their territory. Both countries felt like the Ohio River Valley was owned by them, and so this was a territory that they were fighting over. It had several rivers, and as we know, rivers provide a lot of resources such as food, water, rich soil. Also, this was uncharted territory. They just had the Native Americans there. So they saw it as cheap, accessible land that they could acquire and again gain more territory. So the French saw the British forts, and of course they laid claim to it and were pretty much telling the British, you need to remove yourself, you need to get out, this is our territory. And vice versa, the British saw the French forts and were telling the French, no, this is our territory, you're going to take your group of people and you're going to move out. The British were outnumbering the French by far. They had way more colonists, but the French had something on their side, and that was they had an alliance with the Indians. And that's why it's called the French and Indian War, is because the French were in an alliance with the Indian population. And I'll refer to them as Indians, even though we shouldn't refer to them today as that. But during that time, that's how they referred to them as, because they really didn't know any better. The population of the English or British colonies, as we know it, were growing very rapidly, and so their population was rising. And of course, the French and the Indians were very fearful of that, because it seemed as though they were getting a little too comfortable and making themselves at home, and they weren't just sticking to that eastern border or those 13 colonies. They were starting to infiltrate into the western part of the United States, or even western part of Canada, and the French and the Indians wanted to put a stop to that. Now, the first conflict involved this young man right here, and he is a very young 21-year-old George Washington, who is a major for the British Army. And he is told by the British government, who is represented in the state of Virginia, to go and lead a small force of men into Ohio, that map that I had showed you in 1754. And they had a specific mission, and that mission was to capture the French Fort Duquesne. But he was unsuccessful, and you'll see that George Washington is very young, and he's such a novice soldier, and he's not the established president that we know him to be. He's defeated and he's forced to retreat. And when he's forced to retreat, he has to build his own fort, and he builds a fort named Fort Necessity, because of course it's necessary that he build a fort since he was not able to capture the French fort. He is defeated by the French and Native Americans, or French and Indians, and he is forced to return to Virginia. Now, this is a picture of George Washington at Fort Necessity. And what this shows you is the French and the Indians forced George Washington to sign a document. Now, the unfortunate part is that this document was written all in French. And of course, George Washington didn't know how to read French or speak French. If he did, he spoke very little. And so, one of the issues with signing something that is written in a foreign language is you don't understand what it is you're signing. But of course, he was defeated, so he was forced to sign it if he wanted to return and not be killed. So when he signed this document, what he didn't know was it stipulated that he had murdered a high-ranking French officer, which we have no evidence of. So it very well could be untrue, but because he signed it, this is going to cause even more conflict between the British and the French because they're thinking that the British were responsible for the murder of this high-ranking French officer. The British aren't going to give up. As we know, we talked about this muscle contest and who is the most powerful country in the world. So because they're not giving up, they send in an established military officer, General Edward Braddock, to drive the French out of the Ohio River Valley in 1755. So this is their second attempt. Like George Washington, he is defeated, but he is also killed. So he wasn't like George Washington, who was able to get away and his life was spared. He unfortunately was killed by a French and Indian ambush. So the British at this point in time have already suffered two losses. Because of his death, war was officially declared in 1756. And that's where we see that 7 years. 1754 was what happened with George Washington. 1755, General Edward Braddock and his defeat and his death. And then war in 1756. Now let's go ahead and compare both sides. So we have England and then we have France, each represented by their own name and flag. Each of them has Indian or Native American allies. The British colonies have the Iroquois Indians, and the French have three different and even more, but these are the major allies, the Algonquins, the Hurons, and the Ottawas. Their colonial population, now remember, these are the people that are coming and representing that specific country. So England had a total of roughly 1 million colonists, and France had a significantly lower number in 70,000. So again, just another reason why the Indians took to them more and liked them more, because they seemed as though they were smaller in number, so they weren't as intimidating as the British were, and they weren't too much of a threat. Now, their colonial activities, meaning what did they do when they arrived in in that territory, is the British actually had towns, they had cities, so they were very settled. They also traded and they had farmland. So if you take a look, towns and farmland, it almost seems as though they were there to stay. And as we know, they're trying to acquire more territory, more property. They definitely weren't going to be leaving anytime soon. Whereas the French, their colonial activities consisted of fur trading and missionary priests. So all they were trying to do was get people to convert to their specific religion. So again, nothing too threatening. It did not seem as though they were there to stay. So that was how they were able to acquire a lot more Indian allies. Now, this is going to end the first part of the discussion, or in this case, lecture. And so be on the lookout for the second part of the lecture so that we can finish off the French and Indian War and discuss when we meet next Tuesday.